All right, listener, today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. Excerpts from the first volume of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
Oh, wow.
And before anyone thinks we've, gone off the deep end,
Yeah.
I want to be clear. Our goal is not to endorse any of the hateful ideology in this book.
Right.
We're going to try to understand how Hitler's worldview developed and why this text had such a devastating impact. We'll be focusing on his personal background,
Okay.
early influences,
Yeah.
and the evolution of his ideas, as described in his own words.
Interesting.
And later on, we'll touch on Abraham Foxman's introduction to see how his perspective adds another layer to this complex story.
A very complex story.
Yeah.
It's a chilling but crucial opportunity to analyze history
Yeah.
through the lens of the perpetrator's own words.
Oh, for sure.
By examining his personal narrative, we can gain insights into the motivations and justifications that fueled one of history's darkest chapters.
Yeah, and, he starts by taking us back to his childhood in Braunau-on-the-Inn, a town he considered symbolic,
Okay.
because it sits right on the border of Austria and Germany.
I see.
Seems like a small detail.
Yeah.
But it foreshadows his later obsession with German unification.
It's fascinating how even in these early descriptions, we see glimpses of the ideology that would later define his life.
Yeah.
He even recounts a story about Johannes Palm,
Oh, yeah.
a nationalist figure executed in Braunau for resisting Napoleon.
Okay.
Hitler draws a parallel between Palm and a contemporary German official he disliked, revealing an early tendency to view events through a nationalistic lens.
Almost like he's already constructing a narrative of heroes and villains,
Right.
using history to justify his own developing political views.
Right.
And speaking of influences,
Yeah.
Hitler also contrasts his parents' personalities and aspirations, highlighting the clash between his artistic ambitions and his father's insistence on a civil service career.
This kind of tension between individual desires and societal expectations is a common theme in many lives.
Right.
But in Hitler's case, it seems to have fueled a sense of resentment that he later projected onto entire groups of people.
Yeah, it's almost as if he's looking for someone to blame for his own frustrations.
Right.
And this sense of resentment kind of deepens as we move into his time in Vienna.
Okay.
He describes it as a city of stark contrasts,
Yeah.
a melting pot of cultures and languages,
Interesting.
but also a place of intense social and economic inequality.
Vienna at the turn of the century was a breeding ground for various social and political movements.
Yeah.
It's important to understand this context to grasp the complexities of Hitler's evolving ideology.
Absolutely, and he talks about his failed art school aspirations and the subsequent years of hardship he faced. These experiences seem to have deeply shaped his views on social class and fueled his resentment towards the establishment.
Right.
It was also in Vienna where he first encountered Marxism and began developing his understanding of the social democratic movement.
And keep in mind, this was a time of great social and political upheaval across Europe. The rise of socialist and communist movements created a climate of fear and uncertainty among the existing power structures, which likely influenced Hitler's perception of these ideologies.
He doesn't just reject these movements outright, though.
Right.
He describes engaging in heated debates with his fellow workers,
Oh, really?
many of whom were social democrats,
Okay.
and expresses a sort of twisted fascination with their unwavering adherence to their beliefs.
It's striking how Hitler doesn't just reject Marxism, he grapples with it, tries to understand it, but ultimately twists it to fit his pre-existing prejudices.
Oh, wow.
This demonstrates how even complex ideologies can be warped to serve hateful agendas.
Like he was almost trying to find intellectual justification for his hatred.
Yeah,
And this brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Mein Kampf,
right.
Hitler's gradual transformation into an anti-Semite.
Oh, wow.
He describes his initial skepticism towards anti-Semitic rhetoric,
Okay.
but then he starts attributing various societal problems to Jewish influence.
It's crucial to remember that anti-Semitism was already deeply ingrained in European society at this time.
Yeah.
Hitler didn't invent these prejudices. He absorbed and amplified them,
Yes.
using them as a scapegoat for complex social and economic issues.
He describes Vienna as a place where these anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories were rampant, shaping his perception of Jews as the other.
This highlights the insidious nature of prejudice.
Yeah.
It often starts with subtle biases and stereotypes, which gradually solidify into deeply held beliefs that distort our perception of reality.
And for Hitler, This distortion culminated in what he calls his discovery of the Jewish question.
Okay.
He describes a moment of revelation where he became convinced that the Jews were the root of all social ills.
This is a classic example of scapegoating.
Right.
When faced with complex problems, it's easier to blame a marginalized group than to confront the systemic issues at play.
Yeah.
And this becomes the foundation of his entire worldview.
He starts attributing everything from economic woes to cultural decline to Jewish influence.
This is where we see the danger of confirmation bias in full effect.
Mm-hmm.
Once Hitler embraced this prejudiced worldview, he began interpreting everything through that lens, selectively focusing on information that confirmed his existing beliefs and dismissing anything that contradicted them.
It's like he created his own twisted reality, where Jews were the masterminds behind every societal problem.
Right.
And this leads us to a particularly insidious aspect of his ideology.
Okay.
His belief that Jews were the leaders of the social democratic movement.
This is a prime example of how Hitler used propaganda and rhetoric to demonize his opponents.
Right.
By portraying Jews as the puppet masters behind a movement he opposed.
Right.
He effectively dehumanized them and legitimized violence against them in the eyes of his followers.
He even goes so far as to describe the dialectic of his Jewish opponents.
Right.
Using incredibly dehumanizing language to portray them as slippery and deceitful, twisting the truth and constantly shifting their arguments to avoid being pinned down.
This passage is a masterclass in propaganda.
Oh, for sure.
He utilizes every rhetorical trick in the book to paint Jews as inherently untrustworthy and manipulative, playing on existing societal prejudices to further his own political agenda.
And what's truly frightening is that this kind of rhetoric, this manipulation of language and emotion, is still used today to demonize and dehumanize entire groups of people.
It's a stark reminder that the fight against prejudice and intolerance is far from over.
Absolutely.
Understanding the mechanisms of hate, how it takes root and spreads, is crucial to combating its resurgence in any form.
So we've seen how Hitler's early experiences, his personal frustrations, and the social and political climate of his time all converged to shape his dangerous ideology.
Right.
But there's still much more to uncover.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's unsettling to see how he takes an economic and social theory like Marxism and filters it through this lens of racial hatred, twisting it to justify his own pursuit of power. He even describes moments of feeling almost sorry for the workers, seeing them as victims of a grand conspiracy orchestrated by Jewish intellectuals.
That manipulation is a key aspect of his rhetoric.
Right.
He positions himself as a savior figure, someone who understands the plight of the working class, but believes they've been misled by these destructive Jewish influences.
So he creates this false dichotomy, pitting the working class against an imagined enemy.
Right.
And then presents himself as the solution.
Yeah.
A tactic that's sadly still effective today.
Absolutely.
And he takes it a step further. He talks about how he obsessively studied the foundations of Marxist doctrine.
Wow.
Almost as if he were trying to get inside the minds of its creators.
This intellectual curiosity, albeit warped by prejudice, reveals a crucial aspect of Hitler's personality.
Yeah.
He wasn't just a ranting demagogue. He was a shrewd observer of human behavior and a master manipulator of ideas.
Yeah.
Using his understanding of those ideas to further his own agenda.
He writes about engaging in these endless debates, dissecting arguments, and challenging his opponent's logic. But he always comes back to the same conclusion. Jews are simply incapable of being swayed from their beliefs, no matter how much evidence he presented.
This unwavering conviction in his own twisted worldview is both fascinating and terrifying.
Yeah.
It shows how deeply ingrained prejudice can blind someone to reason and logic, leading them down a path of increasingly extreme beliefs and actions.
It's this dangerous feedback loop where the more entrenched he becomes in his prejudice, the less capable he is of seeing any other perspective.
Right.
And this brings us to another crucial aspect outlined for this deep dive. Hitler's complex relationship with Austria.
Okay.
He was born there, but always felt a stronger connection to Germany.
This tension between his birthplace and his ideological homeland is central to understanding Hitler's worldview.
Yeah.
He rejected Austrian patriotism while embracing a fanatical form of German nationalism.
He describes feeling a deep hatred for the Austrian state, which he viewed as weak and decadent, a hindrance to German unification. He even uses incredibly harsh language, calling Austria a mongrel state and its people racially inferior.
It's important to note that this anti-Austrian sentiment wasn't unique to Hitler.
Okay.
Many in the German-speaking parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire felt a similar longing for unification with a stronger, more unified Germany.
And Hitler saw this as a historical inevitability.
Right.
He believed that Austria was destined to crumble and that Germany would ultimately absorb its German-speaking population.
This belief in German expansionism was rooted in a long tradition of pan-German nationalism,
Right.
which advocated for the unification of all German-speaking peoples under one flag.
Yeah.
But Hitler took this idea to a dangerous extreme.
He envisioned a greater Germany that would dominate Europe,
Right.
a vision fueled by a sense of racial superiority and a belief in the inherent weakness of other nations.
Yeah.
And within that vision, Vienna held a special significance.
Okay.
He repeatedly emphasizes the city's cosmopolitan nature, its mix of cultures and languages.
Yeah.
But instead of seeing this diversity as a strength,
Yeah.
he views it as a threat.
This fear of the other is a recurring theme in nationalist ideologies.
Yeah.
It's based on the idea that national unity and strength can only be achieved through homogeneity, which often leads to the exclusion and persecution of minority groups.
It's like he saw Vienna as a microcosm of everything he hated about the modern world.
Wow.
Diversity, cosmopolitanism, and the mixing of cultures.
Yeah.
He even goes so far as to describe Vienna as the place where German culture is being actively undermined by Jewish influence,
Really?
pointing to the theater, art, literature, and even the press as examples of this supposed cultural decay.
This is a classic propaganda technique. Create a sense of crisis, then blame it on an external enemy
Right.
by portraying German culture as under attack.
Yeah.
Hitler justifies his own calls for radical action and violence.
He's essentially creating a narrative of cultural victimhood,
Yeah.
playing on people's anxieties about societal change and loss of identity.
Right.
And he masterfully exploits those anxieties for his own political gain.
Mm-hmm.
He positions himself as the defender of German culture, the only one who can restore the nation to its former glory.
It's a potent message, especially in a time of economic and political instability.
Sure.
When people are struggling and feeling uncertain about the future,
Yeah.
they're more susceptible to this kind of rhetoric, which promises simple solutions to complex problems and scapegoats to blame for their misfortunes.
It's a chilling reminder of how seemingly innocuous ideas can be twisted and weaponized to justify unimaginable atrocities.
Wow.
And it highlights the dangers of unchecked nationalism.
Absolutely.
When national identity becomes the ultimate measure of worth, it can lead to intolerance, exclusion, and ultimately violence.
Yeah.
We've seen this pattern repeat itself throughout history, and it's a lesson we can't afford to forget.
It's a reminder that we must always be wary of those who seek to divide us based on race, religion, or any other form of difference. We must be critical thinkers, questioning those who try to exploit our anxieties and fears for their own gain.
Absolutely.
History teaches us that unchecked prejudice can have devastating consequences.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Hitler's childhood, his formative years in Vienna, his transformation into an anti-Semite, his twisted understanding of Marxism, and his evolving relationship with Austria.
Right.
But we haven't even touched on Abraham Foxman's introduction yet. And that brings us to Foxman's introduction.
Right.
It provides crucial context for understanding Mein Kampf and the lasting impact it continues to have on the world.
Absolutely.
As a Holocaust survivor, his perspective is incredibly valuable,
Oh.
especially as we try to reconcile these early glimpses of Hitler's ideology with a man who would orchestrate such unimaginable horrors.
You know, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Foxman grapples with the very question of how we should engage with this text.
Mm.
It's both historically significant and morally repugnant.
Yeah.
He argues that ignoring it would be a mistake, allowing Hitler's ideas to fester in the shadows.
It's like pretending the past didn't happen doesn't make it go away.
Exactly.
We have to confront it head on, even if it's painful.
And by understanding the roots of Hitler's ideology,
Right.
we can be better equipped to counter similar forms of hatred and extremism that emerge today.
It seems like such a crucial point.
Yeah.
You know, we can't just wish this stuff away.
Absolutely.
We have to really understand it to be able to prevent it from happening again.
Foxman also emphasizes the importance of critical thinking,
Okay.
warning against simply accepting Hitler's words at face value.
Like, we can't just read it passively.
Right.
We have to analyze it with a discerning eye, challenge its assumptions, and recognize the manipulation and distortion within those pages.
It's a crucial reminder that we must always be vigilant against propaganda and misinformation, regardless of its source.
Absolutely.
And this is especially important in today's world,
Oh, yeah?
where information spreads so rapidly and easily.
It's like we're bombarded with it constantly. So we need to be able to distinguish fact from fiction and critically evaluate the information we consume.
We need to develop a sort of internal filter
Yeah.
to sift through the noise and identify the dangerous rhetoric that can lead to prejudice and hatred.
And that's perhaps the most valuable lesson we can take from this deep dive into Mein Kampf.
Absolutely.
It's a chilling reminder of how seemingly innocuous ideas can be twisted and manipulated to serve hateful agendas.
Right.
But by understanding the forces that shaped Hitler's worldview,
Mm-hmm.
by recognizing the warning signs of extremism,
Yeah.
and by cultivating critical thinking skills,
Absolutely.
we can be better equipped to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
So, listener, I really think that's something to take away from this.
Yeah.
We can't just dismiss this book as the ramblings of a madman.
Right.
We need to engage with it critically,
Yeah.
learn from its darkness,
Mm-hmm.
and use those insights to identify and challenge the subtle signs of intolerance and extremism that exist in our own societies today.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive into Mein Kampf, I want to leave you with this.
Yeah.
We can't simply dismiss this book as the ramblings of a madman.
Right.
We need to engage with it critically, learn from its darkness, and use those insights to identify and challenge the subtle signs of intolerance and extremism that exist in our own societies today.
The fight against hatred and intolerance is a continuous one.
It is.
A battle that requires constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to the values of equality, justice, and human dignity.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's a fight that we must all participate in if we truly want to create a world where the horrors of the past are never repeated.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these very questions.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.